So for our first keynote, I would like to bring up a man who needs no introduction. He's a highly respected voice in the industry, leading one of the largest suppliers, which crosses essentially every product category. He's someone who gives back to the industry generously, lending his expertise through any number of committees and speaking engagements, including multiple tours of duty on the PPAI board of directors. Please welcome David Nicholson, President of Polyconcept North America, to the stage. David, it's so great to have you here.
Hi, Catherine.
In honor of you being here, I am wearing the skucamp Pittsburgh shirt.
Wonderful.
So we are going to have a great conversation over the course of the next 25 minutes. We'll save hopefully a little bit of time at the end for questions if they're popping through kind of on the chat, but I know we've got a ton of awesome stuff that we want to cover today. So our topic is around supply chain. And David, you have an incredible wealth of knowledge in this area, and were gracious enough to share this with us. That's some of your thoughts at skucamp in Pittsburgh last year. And obviously, a lot has changed in the landscape since that point in time. We were already in kind of a crazy time then with tariffs and everything else, and now we're in an even crazier time. So I want to kick off with saying we know COVID's had a devastating effect on many suppliers and their production capabilities. How do you see the impact of COVID affecting the industry as we begin to open back up?
Yeah, so maybe what I can share is what we've been going through on our end, and then shift a little bit into what I think some of the impacts have been. But I think for most suppliers, and I guess distributors as well, that the immediate challenge was survival. I mean, this happened so quickly. This went from an issue we were really thinking about as a supply challenge to one that now became very much a demand challenge, and beyond the obvious health issues. So I think for many suppliers, it was really thinking about how do we ensure our health, our financial health through this? How do we ensure that we're in a position when this does start to recover that we're as healthy as we can be? So, financial condition, liquidity were certainly top of mind. Managing inventory. So you think about the supply chain, and we'll get into this in more detail today, but we operate with long lead times. So turning off that tap when we started to see this was extremely difficult. So I think for most suppliers, dealing with inventory was a primary concern. We had to adjust our capacities, in terms of the number of folks we had in our plants and trying to figure out, okay, where's this going to bottom out? So a lot of time looking at how do we adjust our capacity so that we're ensuring our financial health, but how do we also adjust our capacity so that we make sure we come out of this we're still with a team and a workforce that's ready to go when the recovery happens. And then I think most importantly was taking care of our employees. We were able, fortunately, to keep most of our plants running. So a lot of time around just the safety and thinking about how do we ensure an environment that we can continue to operate safely. So those were a lot of the very much kind of the things that we've been thinking about over the last 3 years, 4 weeks. And I think for many of us, we've started to shift and start to look ahead. And, I think a big part of where we started to spend our time is thinking about what does the recovery look like? And, trying to form a point of view, or at least multiple points of view. And part of that is acknowledging that this is likely going to be a very much an uneven recovery. And I think one of the impacts for this industry is going to be how well do companies adjust to an environment that's really unpredictable and that's going to be bumpy. I think even in the most optimistic scenarios, it's going to be bumpy. Our view is at least through the middle of next year. So I think a big part of this is, one of the impacts is just how do companies adjust to now a much less certain environment. I think the next impact, that we've been thinking about is how do we restart our operations? So how do you bring employees back? Again, how do you do that safely? How many workers do we bring back, and how quickly as we start to recover? A big part of, I know will be a topic today, and I think in multiple sessions, will be how do we sell in this new environment that's now increasingly digital in an industry that's very used to being face-to-face with physical product. So I think that's a significant implication. When do we start traveling? When are we going to be able to start to see people? And what's that mean
And
for
who
our
wants to
citizens?
get on a plane?
And who wants to get on a plane?
Yeah.
So I think that, there's still a lot of questions that I think we're wrestling through. But what I would share with the audience, I think, in terms of, at least if you're thinking about the near-term recovery period, I think there's three capabilities for both suppliers and distributors that can be really, really important. And so the first, and we'll pick this up in more detail around some of the supply chain discussions, but first is this idea of resilience. And I think for all of us, we have to think about our businesses in terms of how do we make sure that when we get that next shock, we're not back in the same position. And so, shoring up for us, it's very much our supply chain and our operations to be more flexible. I think is going to be really important. I think adaptability is going to be another key capability. We just don't know what the future holds, and our ability to change, adjust our business model where it needs to be adjusted, is going to be, I think, a really important capability for both suppliers and distributors.
I think just getting comfortable with the unknown, around the fact that every day it seems like it's a new adventure and you have no idea what's coming next week. So I think that sense of the anxiety that brings with it is really part of what people have really been struggling with. And as you say, that the recovery is going to be long and bumpy, and there's so much that's unknown out there.
Yeah, and if you think about how important communication is right now. I think for us, communication to our customers and certainly to our employees is really, really important, acknowledging just what you said, Catherine, which is we don't have all the answers. We'll control what we can control, but there's a lot that's out of our purview right now, and you have to accept that.
Yeah. So last year at skucamp, you gave an amazing presentation about the threats to the supply chain at the time, an over-reliance on China. COVID obviously puts that reality into very sharp focus, making it evident to us all. As we think about the future, post-COVID, what are your views today and thoughts on some of the implications for the industry supply chain as a whole?
Yeah, it's hard to believe that was just, I guess, eight months.
It feels like a lifetime ago.
Yeah. I think for those that weren't able to participate, the central premise of what I talked about was that we had a supply chain that was very much under threat. And this was, again, more in the context of tariffs than it was the current virus crisis. And, the premise was this idea that we had an industry that had largely been built on the back of China. And as China emerged as the global producer for the world with almost unlimited capacity and, access to almost any product and unlimited capacity and lower prices, you had an industry that really thrived and, quite honestly, if we look back, became over-reliant on China. And the tariff situation, so last fall, what we were dealing with, the tariff situation really exposed that. I would argue we were going to have that day of reckoning anyway. The tariffs just simply accelerated that. So, yes, you're right. The virus situation now adds another level of complexity and threat to, again, what I would argue was a supply chain that was already seeing some cracks in it. And so you now have a situation with the virus and the safety concerns and the fact that this is really truly a global issue. You have, I saw one figure, you have 93% of the world's population, I think it's close to 80+% of the world's GDP that has been subject to economic and social restrictions. And I think some of that will reverse. We're not going to be in this world forever. But it's safe to assume that I think we are going to be in a world with still some level of restriction for foreseeable future. And again, I think simply just getting on a plane and flying 18 hours to China is not going to be the same experience that I've had over the last 25 years.
You'll do it in a hazmat suit instead.
Well, yeah, I don't know what that looks like, but I think what was already a rising nationalism and a move away from globalization. So we saw that obviously in a number of elections. We saw that in immigration policy. this just adds, again, one more barrier, and I think one more push that is going to make nationalism certainly more prevalent than it had been, and understandably, given what we've all been through. So you put that now in the context of our industry supply chain, again, that's been highly, highly dependent on China, and you're left with the question, okay, we have these risks, we now have even more significant challenges, what do we do? And unfortunately, there's not an easy answer. And again, that was one of the certainly conclusions. I think a number of suppliers have been successful moving outside of China. But there's a number of categories where that's still not really a viable, at least near-term viable option. And, listen, I think everyone's looking at U.S. and domestic and nearshore options. Again, 5-10 years from now, that might be an option. Today, that is really not a near-term solution. So we do have a significant challenge. And, you think about, for suppliers who really have never had to worry too much about securing capacity, and for distributors who really haven't had to worry about the resilience of their supply base, that very much is in question. And we may not be seeing it yet today, but we are certainly going to see it over the next 12 to 18 months.
I mean, it's remarkable when you hear companies like Intel talking about onshoring production, and when high tech like that, to think about domestic manufacturing coming back in that kind of context just is such an indicator of how companies are thinking, about that and the risks.
Yeah, it is, and I think one of the other undercurrents, and certainly the distributors would have a better feel for this, but there is, right or wrong, a bit of a bias against China because it is viewed as the source of this. It's certainly created a lot of political discord in the U.S. To a relationship that was already under threat or under pressure between Trump and the Chinese administration. So you just have a far more complicated geopolitical environment. Again, that is the idea of having seamless international trade. International trade is going to be far more challenging.
So just shifting gears a bit, one of the things that we spoke about last year was just an overall shift towards sustainability and the desire for the market to have kind of options that were more sustainable. And right now, what we're seeing is, ironically, especially in the healthcare environment, a shift to the opposite direction where everything needs to be disposable, and also just how it is that the fear of kind of reusing items means some grocery stores are banning reusable bags, as an example. So, what do you think the impact is kind of on this for sustainability in general? Social compliance, kind of in both the short term and the long term. Is it going to accelerate more socially responsible attitudes and accountability because people are buying less, or will sustainability be less important because everyone's just trying to survive? Yeah,
we've been debating this quite a bit internally. I'll offer my perspective. Take it for what it's worth. I was really encouraged, and one of the things I talked about last fall was this move, and I think it was really important for this industry to progress both in terms of its supply chain transparency around social compliance and start to acknowledge how do we become a more sustainable industry, because let's be honest, this is an industry that in some ways flies in the face of sustainability. So it really was an issue we needed to proactively address. And I think I shared with you, or this was Mark, when I did an interview at PPAI, that I really viewed sustainability as the next compliance for this industry. This was going to be an opportunity for this industry really to be proactive and take an important step forward. Unfortunately, my point of view is that I believe this crisis is a complete reset of priorities for most companies. And so if you think about all the way through the supply chain, you have end users or end buyers who now, quite honestly, are just going to be focused on other things. And, where sustainability had been almost risen to the level of a corporate value, that probably still stays, but where are they going to be putting their money and their time and energy? It's probably certainly not at the level it was a year ago around sustainability. So unfortunately, I think one of the casualties of this crisis is going to be that, transparency of supply chain, social compliance, sustainability, all the things that I think all of us believe are really important for this industry, are just going to take a back step. And to some degree, it's going to be important, but just not as important as it had been.
Well, and maybe the opportunity, to weave that in as places of production shift, and kind of how those new places start up, that the foundation at which they begin kind of is where kind of there could be a starting point. But I agree that it all has to come from the demand in the first place in terms of the end user. So there's only so much control kind of we have over that.
Yeah, exactly.
So speaking of end users, through the last recession, we saw a dramatic change in how buyers kind of perceive and purchase promo. What's your outlook on how this will change the perception of our medium itself? Like, will the end buyer value the tactical, emotional experience of merchandise more?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things that I've been thinking about. First is, if you think about the demographics of our end buyers. So I think we, as an industry, have acknowledged that we have an increasingly younger demographic. And you think about what they've gone through in their career. So many started their career in the 08-09 crisis. And then literally within a decade had this, what is now, I think, likely going to be an even more significant life event for this generation.
Just as they're hitting their stride.
Just as they're hitting their stride. And if you look at the nature of demographics and generations, typically they're defined by these types of events. And, you can imagine, having lived through this during those formative years of your career, there are going to be permanent, you can call them scars, certainly permanent changes to your behavior, how you make decisions, how you think about relationships that are going to be long lasting. I think one of the ones that I think is a relatively safe one to assume that's going to play out, and this did happen in 08 and 09, and I think it's going to happen again this time from an end buyer perspective, is this idea of a flight to value and a flight to quality. And I think that's going to be certainly relevant for our industry. So, this idea where if an end buyer is going to make a promotional purchase in a world where budgets are constrained, they are going to be much more selective about what they buy. And that could be, it could be much more budget conscious, but it also could be much more quality conscious, that if they're going to spend the money, they really want something that's going to be meaningful for their clients. And I think for our industry to understand that shift and recognize that that's going to change both what we sell, but more importantly, how we ascribe value to what we sell, is going to be that much more important, because discretionary purchases are largely going to be off the table. So I think this idea, the first theme I would focus on is this idea of that we're going to see this shift or flight to value and quality. The second is, I think, and again, this is, if you think back to what this generation has gone through, I think you're going to see a much higher premium on risk management and austerity. And I just believe that the fact that they've lived through two significant disruptive events is going to put a premium on safety and security, much more than I think we would have seen 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago. And so again, if you think about your role, either for us as a supplier or your previous world, Catherine, as a distributor, your ability to articulate a value of why you understand the importance of safety and security in this world, I think is going to be a much more important part of the value proposition, again, than it had been even a year ago. And the last, and this is a much more optimistic view of the relevance of promotional products, is I think coming out of this, in a world that is going to be much more digital, much more contactless, where people can't necessarily be in front of their customers or their employees, I think there's a really, really compelling case for promotional products in that world. It is a physical touch in a world that is far less physical. And I think that concept of, that we're going to be living in a distant world is, I think, a very reasonable assumption. And I think there's a really compelling argument for promotional products in that world. Again, it requires us to think differently about how we position the products and how they're used. But I think it's a tremendous opportunity for this industry.
And interestingly, with the shift to quality, that you also have a huge upheaval happening right now from a distribution perspective. I mean, you think about sporting events and conferences and trade shows, and all of the areas where we used to give away large quantities of usually lower kind of priced items, and all of that is now gone. And so in a world where you're having to ship things to people's homes or to make alternative arrangements, that you're going to think, as you say, very carefully about what it is that you're going to send and what the impact is going to be.
Yeah, and I think just building on that, the idea that for both suppliers and distributors in this industry supply chain, we have to think about how we distribute this product far differently, right? And it's going to require new capabilities. We were just thinking about it, for our holiday catalog. How are we going to mail them, right? We don't know most of our distributors' home addresses.
Right.
Similar to the comment I think that was made at the opening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, lots of changes. So this has gone by so fast. We've got a few minutes left. I know this is a tough question, but how do you think the industry is going to change through this? Like, what are some of the macro themes, such as economic recovery, that are affecting us, which will likely result in permanent changes to our industry?
In under 2 minutes?
Yes. And go.
Yeah, I think the first thing I would highlight is where I started, which is I think it's really important for this industry to understand this is going to be, a bit of a bumpy road to recovery. And so, I think you have to reset, certainly if you haven't yet, reset expectations, and really think about, what parts of your business need to change. And quite honestly, this is a great time to make changes in the business. You don't, for most of us, we don't have a ton of volume. There's not a lot of risk to making change. And you have a pretty strong impetus and case for change to do it today.
Don't let a good crisis go to waste, right?
Exactly. So I think that's a big part of it. And I think, those that are successful at making those changes and doing so rapidly are going to be the most successful coming out of this. So I think how companies approach the recovery is going to be, I think, a key determinant and certainly a lasting impact for this industry. I think what we just talked about relative to the use of promotional products is going to be, while I think still very relevant, it's going to be different. And that's going to have implications for what categories are relevant, what end user verticals are relevant or opportunities, and which ones aren't. And I think, again, that's going to require shifts for all of us. I think you're likely to see, and we saw this in 08 and 09, these are typically the times when you see new entrants come into the market, folks that maybe had their eye in the space and their core market now is under pressure. So they look for adjacent markets. So I think we're likely to see some new entrants emerge. I think, I guess it depends on your view on the severity of this and how long it lasts. In terms of what does this mean for consolidation and M&A activity. There's no question it will create M&A opportunities. Does this lead to a hyper consolidation of this industry? I think if this is a really prolonged and drawn out recovery, I think the landscape 2 years from now could look very different. If it's, you take a little more optimistic view, I think, listen, there are going to be some people that don't make it through. But I don't think you're going to see, if you take a more optimistic view, a wholesale change in the structure of this industry. I think similarly, I would guess a lot of the questions, do we think people are going to start selling direct? Our view isn't certainly that that's imminent. Again, if it's prolonged, you might see some people that get desperate.
Well, optimism ultimately needs to lead the way here. Yes. Unfortunately, this industry has proven itself to be remarkably resilient. So Mark is now going to come back on stage to introduce our first skucon story. But David, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and taking this time. We really, really appreciate it. You've been a great friend, and we always appreciate you being willing to come on this journey with us and take this time. Thank you.
Well, happy to do it, and congratulations, and a lot of kudos for pulling this event together. Terrific turnout.
Awesome. Thank you.